Hello and welcome to the Christ Baptist Church devotional as we're going through the book of Genesis, and now we find ourselves in Genesis chapter 46. So I hope you've been following along with us. The first 45 chapters that take us through how God is preserving his promise. He's ensuring that his promise is going to unfold in the plan of redemption, where Adam and Eve rebelled in the garden in chapter 3 of Genesis. And ever since then, God has made a promise, and he's been showing how he is continually fulfilling that promise through a group of really unfaithful people. And that's been happening through the history of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob now and his family, 12 sons, and we've been going through the life of Joseph. Joseph is the young man. He's not the youngest now of Jacob's family, because there was a brother that Joseph had called Benjamin, came off of Jacob and his wife Rebecca. And so now we take a look and see, or actually it was Rachel, not Rebecca. And so now we see Joseph after he's been in Egypt now for some time. And actually at this time here we can just calculate that Joseph's been in Egypt for 22 years. He's now 39 years old. Going in. We can calculate that by knowing that Joseph was 17 when he was introduced to us in the first story in Genesis. I believe it's Genesis 38. He was introduced to us there at 17 years old when he was thrown into the pit. He had 13 years in prison. And then there were 7 years of a good famine after he came out of prison and talked to Pharaoh. And then 2 years of the famine of the bad, or 7 years of the good harvest, and then 2 years of the famine came. So that gives us a total of 39 years that he is old in Egypt. Been 22 years since Jacob has seen him. And here, what we're going to see here in this chapter, where it details a lot of the family of Jacob, but there is really something for us here, which is how God preserves his people in accomplishing his promise. How God goes about preserving his people, and he does so in ways that are a bit unusual, but we can take comfort in what God says about it. Let's just take a look here as we read Genesis chapter 46. Start in verse 1, just to get our perspective here. So Israel sent out with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to God of his father Isaac. And it's interesting how we're talking about the father Jacob in chapter 44, but then when we get to chapter 45, verse 28, which is the verse just before this, we see now the author calling him Israel. His name was Jacob, now it's Israel here. It's been interchanged back and forth. It's interesting how in chapter 45 we see Jacob being mentioned quite a bit, and then there is Israel. And so Israel set out with all that he had, because he is now believing his sons, because they see the wagons full of stuff and all of that. And one of the things that in God preserving his people, he ensures that his people, because he prepared them, Jacob saw the blessing, he saw what's happening, it's believable. So what happened is Jacob is very thankful. And he went to Beersheba. We see that in verse 1. Beersheba is the place where Abraham made a sacrifice there with the king at the place, and made a treaty. Isaac sacrificed there. That's where God revealed himself. It's on the edge of the desert and the border of Israel, or Canaan. And he offered sacrifice to the God of his father Isaac. And why would he offer sacrifices? Well, he just had great news. He's going to go see his son Joseph, whom he thought was dead, resurrected in a way. And so he offered these thank offerings to God. And here he is going now down to Egypt. But he's concerned because he was promised the land of Canaan. And so he's thinking, we should be getting the land of Canaan. Now you want me to leave Canaan with all that I've got? How will I know I'm going to receive that? But he went to God first and said, I'm going to trust you. And I'm very thankful that I have Joseph back. And so he gives a way for his people to be able to demonstrate thanks in the case of uncertainty here. So there's great uncertainty. Jacob's going to Egypt, and he could be greatly fearful here. And so what does God provide? Well, the first thing that he provides along with Jacob now being thankful, is words of hope is what he gives. We see that here in verses essentially 2 through 4. We get specific words of hope. God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, here I am. He said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you a great nation there. I'll go down with you to Egypt, and I will also surely bring you up again, and Joseph will close your eyes. So we see some specific words of hope here. And I wanted to just bring to your attention in Genesis, there's a little bit of a parallel here of how God is preserving his people. He did the same preservation back in Genesis 6 with Noah. The whole world was going along. It was pretty wicked and pagan and growing in its wickedness. And God saw Noah that he was blameless in all his ways. Righteous man. God had grace in the eyes of, Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And so he said, this is my people right here, Noah and his family. And at the time it was Noah, his wife, and his 3 sons and their children. All of them, the whole family. He said, this is who you are. And they were very thankful, and they obeyed in what God said. In other words, God's saying, I'm going to take you, Noah, and your family, and you're going to leave all this whole culture. And there's going to be a flood. And you need to build a boat and go inside. Pretty frightening to go inside this huge wooden structure, because you're saying all around it's going to be destroyed. And I'm going to preserve you in it. Well, look what we have here. There's a famine. It's starting to just starve the whole world. But you need to go into this foreign structure here called Egypt. And so Jacob says, I've been now preparing myself. I'm going to trust God. And look what God's first word of promise is. First divine promise here. There's 4 of them. We see them right here in verses 3 and 4. First he says, I am the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt. So he says, don't be afraid. Why? Number 1, for I'll make you a great nation there. This is just like what he gave to Abraham. I'll make of you a great nation. But there's a little bit of difference here in this verse here. I want you to look carefully at verse 3. He says, I will make you a great nation there. Not in Canaan, there. Now, it doesn't mean God's changing his promise. No, God is going to fulfill his promise. You're going to see this in one of the other words of hope that he has. But right now he's saying, Jacob, you need to go to Egypt because I'm going to make you a great nation there in Egypt. And we see in the book of Exodus that surely happened. It starts with Jacob's family, only Jacob's family. They come into the land of Egypt. But by the time Exodus chapter 1 rolls around, it's a couple of hundred years, about 300 years after they came in, and well, actually it's 400 years after they came in, but after those centuries go by, they become a great multitude, millions of people. So great that Pharaoh in Exodus chapter 1 is really afraid of them. They're a great nation, and they're made a great nation there. And the idea of going into Egypt had to be frightening to Jacob, so he gives them the second command here, the second divine promise. He says, and I will go down with you to Egypt. So in other words, by you going to Egypt, you're not disobeying me. You're not rebelling. Remember in the previous commands under Jacob and Isaac and Abraham, it's you need to stay here. You know, but they went to Egypt anyway. They ran away at times to get out of the land because it was difficult. Here, he's saying, I want you to go, and you're going to be made a great nation there. This tells us that, you know, as God's people, we think we should be having a place that God prepares for us, and especially according to the promise. And as New Testament Christians, we look forward to the promise of the kingdom and the world and that. But God says, I'm going to make you a great nation there in the midst of pagan Gentiles. What does he tell Daniel? In the midst of Babylon, reside there. What does Jeremiah say? 70 years you will reside in Babylon. You're going to be there. You're going to be a great nation there. And then you'll come out. You see, God's going to take us ultimately where we need to go. But he will preserve us in the midst of dangerous territory. And we can be sure that we're safe because I will go down with you to Egypt. We're in his will. We're there. There's no safer place to be than in God's will. And Thirdly, the divine promise, and I will surely bring you up again. See, I've not forgot my promise. You're going to go to the land of Canaan. You are going to make it there. I'll bring you up again. We know that when you go into Egypt, the promise of God, as we see in Deuteronomy and the book of Hebrews for us in the New Testament, I will never leave you nor forsake you. God is not geographically bound. He isn't saying, I'm going to provide for you here in this spot. Sure, there's a promise that we'll ultimately get there. But in the meantime, wherever we are, he'll make a great nation out of Jacob there in Egypt. And he will work with us wherever we are. In the midst of tough pagan societies, that's fine. He's with us continually. We can always have hope that no matter where we are, he's not forsaking us here. Just like Jacob had to understand, I'm not going to forsake you in Egypt. And not only that, the fourth item here is, and Joseph will close your eyes. You're going to see Joseph again. So to get Jacob motivated to go down to Egypt, he gives him words of hope that connect to his promise. I'll make you a great nation there. So go to Egypt, because there is when I'm going to increase you. And we see this, and we know that in Exodus, we see coming out of Exodus, they say, the verse says, 430 years to the day, as they were leaving out of Exodus. 430 years to the day. They're leaving. And they plundered the Egyptians. They became very rich, going to the land of Canaan, the land of promise. Because the sin of the Amorites has been made full. That's Genesis chapter 15. That God promised that's when it's going to happen. So God's fulfilling his promise, his word. But while we wait for his promise to be fulfilled, he's taking care of us. He's taking care of Jacob right here, making him a great nation with him, and promises to bring him back up again. And his bones were buried in Egypt. That's the last time people went back into Canaan, is when Jacob died. They buried him in Canaan and came back into Egypt. But the first lead donkey as they were leaving Egypt is the bones of Joseph. The bones of Joseph. They're going out and they're going to be able to get into Canaan. God is faithful. And so we see that there's words of hope right there. Thirdly, when God is going to preserve his people, to accomplish his promise, it includes all the people. Not some, not the most holy, not the most favored. All of God's people are included. This goes from verse 5 all the way down into verse 27. Let me just read this for you. You can see. Then Jacob arose from Beersheba, and the sons of Israel carried their father Jacob and their little ones with their wives in the wagons which Pharaoh had sent to carry him. They took their livestock and their property, which they had acquired in the land of Canaan, and came to Egypt. Jacob and all his descendants with him. All his descendants with him. Now I know we have a big number here from verses 8 to 27, but just park your eyes on verse 7 there for a moment. His sons and his grandsons with him, but also his daughters and his granddaughters, and all his descendants he brought with him to Egypt. And that's a lot. From verses 8 to 27, we only see the males listed. We only see the males listed. We don't see the daughters and granddaughters. There's a whole bunch of those as well. But just for the sake of symmetry and emphasis here, the only thing that's listed is so we get to the number 70. It's not exactly 70 because we've got daughters and granddaughters and a number of others there. And so we want the names of the 12 because this is where the names of the 12 tribes come, and they are preserved in Egypt. Now these are the names of the sons of Israel, Jacob and his sons who went to Egypt. Reuben, Jacob's firstborn. The sons of Reuben, Hanok and Palu and Hezron and Carmi. The sons of Simeon, Jemuel and Jamin and Ohad and Jachin and Zohar and Shaul the son of a Canaanite woman. The sons of Levi, Gershon and Kohath and Merari. The sons of Judah, and Onan and Shelah and Perez and Zerah. But and Onan died in the land of Canaan. And the sons of Perez were Hezron and Hamel. See, we learned about that when we traced an episode of Judah in between the chapters of Joseph. And he had two sons, and Onan, and they both died in the land of Canaan. They're listed here. They're sons, but they died. Verse 13, the sons of Issachar, Tolan, Puvah, and Yob, and Shimron. The sons of Zebulun, Sered, and Elon, and Jaleel. These are the sons of Leah, whom she bore to Jacob in Paddan Aram, with his daughter Dinah. All his sons and his daughters numbered 33. The sons of Gad, Ziphion, and Haggi, Shuni, and Ezbon, Eri, and Arodi, and Areli. The sons of Asher, Imah, and Ishva, and Isbi, and Beriah, and their sister Sarah. So there's one of the daughters listed right there. And the sons of Beriah, Heber, and Malchiel. These are the sons of Zilpah, whom Laban gave to his daughter Leah. She bore to Jacob these 16 persons. The sons of Jacob's wife Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin. Now, Joseph in the land of Egypt were born Manasseh and Ephraim, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore to him. The sons of Benjamin, Bela and Becher, and Ashbel, Gera and Naaman, Ahi and Rosh, Mupim and Hupim and Ard. These are the sons of Rachel, who were born to Jacob. There were 14 persons in all. The sons of Dan, Hushim. Sons of Naphtali, Jaziel, and Guni, and Jezer, and Shillem. These are the sons of Bilhah, whom Laman gave to his daughter Rachel, and she bore these to Jacob. There were 7 persons in all. Just on some notes here, we see that Rachel gave birth to 14, and her maid Bilhah gave 7. And Leah had 33, and her maid Zilpah had 16. So basically, the original wives had twice as many kids as their maids. But there's nothing really special about that. It's just something to note. And it all adds up to 70 here, as 70 people, which includes Joseph and Manasseh and Ephraim, which were in Egypt, because you can see in verses 26 and 27, all the persons belonging to Jacob who came to Egypt, his direct descendants, not including the wives of Jacob's sons, were 66 persons in all, plus Jacob, that would be 67. And the sons of Joseph who were born to him in Egypt were 2. All the persons of the house of Jacob who came to Egypt were 70. The issue is not, do we get 70 or 69 or 71? They arranged it here to write it here so that we get 70 people, showing it's a complete family, everything. We go back to verse 7. In verse 6, the end of verse 6, all his descendants with him, his sons, his grandsons with him, his daughters and his granddaughters, all his descendants he brought with him to Egypt. Everybody. What happened in Genesis 6? Everybody in the ark. Shem, Ham, and Japheth with their wives, Noah with his wife, everybody in the family in the ark. Everybody. No one is excluded. And so, we see that it's going to include all the people are going to be provided for, not just Jacob, not just Jacob and Joseph. God has a promise for all his people, even those who are just converted, even those who have been walking with him a long time. It doesn't matter. When you're in the family, you're in the family. And God has a promise for his people, as he does here with Jacob. Lastly, what we see here, in verses 28, going down to him to 34, God also prepares the place where you're going. It might be a frightening place, Egypt, dark, it's pagan, it's just way different than anything they've ever been associated with. They're outnumbered. God prepares that. So when God makes a place for you, and it's going to be very frightening for you to be in, God is also preserving you in that place. He's protecting you in that place, and he's providing for you in that place. Verse 28, now he sent Judah before him to Joseph to point out the way to him before him to Goshen, and they came into the land of Goshen. Joseph prepared his chariot, went up to Goshen to meet his father Israel. As soon as he appeared before him, he fell on his neck and wept on his neck a long time. So they really had a great embrace right there in Goshen. Goshen is in the outskirts. It's going to be in the eastern outskirts of Egypt, out of the city where Pharaoh was. Which means it's also pasture land. It's very excellent pasture land, very excellent place to do all your raising your animals and so forth. Then Israel said to Joseph, now let me die, since I've seen your face, that you are still alive. He feels he can die in peace now. Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, I will go up and tell Pharaoh and will say to him, my brothers and my father's household who are in the land of Canaan have come to me, and the men are shepherds, for they have been keepers of livestock. and they have brought their flocks and their herds and all that they have. When Pharaoh calls you and says, what is your occupation? You shall say, your servants have been keepers of livestock from your youth, even until now, both we and our fathers, that you may live in the land of Goshen, for every shepherd is loathsome to the Egyptians. You see, they couldn't really connect in with the Egyptians. Egyptians don't see them as being part of Egyptian culture, so they have a place that's just outside. They're not going to be intermingled where they're going to be persecuted. They have the land where they can have all their flocks go. They're bringing their own flocks, so they're not considered to be a burden on the land. Joseph wisely, as the number 2 in Egypt, is telling them, this is what we're going to say. He prepares the place. He goes up to tell Pharaoh, and here they are, and they're shepherds. And they brought their own flocks and herds, so there's not going to be a burden on you. In the midst of this famine, they're not going to be asking for anything. And when Pharaoh says, what's your occupation, you agree with what I just said. We're keepers of livestock, both we and our fathers. And we want to live in Goshen, not in Egypt, not where you are, not in your city, because we know that that would be a conflict. So they're creating honor and a way to have great prosperity. So this begins their farming here, where they go out and they're going to prosper in terms of herds, flocks, and people now for 400 years. And I believe this is really the place where we start saying, when did Israel occupy Egypt? Right here. And it's 430 years now, to the very day that that Egypt, or that Israel came out of Egypt. And we see this in Exodus chapter 12, verse 41. At the end of 430 years, to the very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. So, when they came in, it was a big day. And then when they left 430 years later, they plundered the Egyptians, took all their gold, took all their silver, and left as a huge nation with millions of people. God prospered them. That's how God preserves his people. And often, like with the ark, he preserved them in the ark while the rest of the world then was suffering God's wrath, which is what was happening with this famine. His people were preserved. His people were preserved. The remnant continued to thrive and grow because he's with them. And he continues to promise, I'll bring you. Might not be your generation, but there will be a generation that makes it to the promised land. The specific land that's promised in Canaan. That's what he has with Egypt. God will specifically deliver Israel into the promised land. And we've seen that since 1948. After about 1,800 years, 1,870 years or so, Israel got back in their land. And they've got a country, a nation, a capital. They're on the world scene. God's faithful, always faithful to his promise. Why? So that we can see through Israel, God will be faithful to us. As the church is often called to be around a people that don't know God. They're blind. They're hostile. But God preserves his promise, preserves his people. During that, I will be with you, but I'm going to make you a great nation there. In other words, if we're going to flourish, we're going to flourish there where God's put you. Not flourish when we get to another place. No, where you are, you will flourish there because God's with you, and there's a promise. He'll bring you up out of there to be with him forever. That's what we can hold on to here, looking at how God preserves his people while accomplishing his promise. That's what we see here in Genesis chapter 46. We hope to see you again in Genesis chapter 47.